Hi, my name is Tiandra Parker, and today we're going to look at developing, gathering, analyzing, and interpreting data for ELL students. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce you to my student who we will call Robert. Robert moved to Kentucky from Puerto Rico in November with both of his parents. Robert has two siblings. One is in elementary, one's in seventh, and Robert himself is in eighth grade. Neither of Robert's parents speak English. However, we do know that Robert's mother has an associate's degree and she is a licensed cosmetologist. She's a stay-at-home mom here in Kentucky, and we do know that his father works outside the home. When we tested Robert tested his overall access was a 2.2, and so there is room for Robert to grow, but Robert has done very well since he's been here in Kentucky. So now we want to look at some ways to assess Robert. What are those best practices for assessing Robert or ELL students? And we're not going to just look at standardized test scores, but we're also going to look at those things that are comprehensive and balanced assessment systems. So with that being said, we will start out with the system that is best for ELL students, which is the as, for, of approach. Now, the as, for, of approach is a culmination of formative assessments and summative assessments. It is an approach that is comprehensive and balanced. So we'll look at each component and talk about those. The as component, one of the things that should be noted about as, for, of, it is a performance-based assessment, which allows you to pull in students' prior knowledge as well as to pull in their culture. Because it is performance-based, students have choice and those kind of things, and so it does allow them to pull in those features. So looking at the as part of it or process, as is really student-driven. It is that process where students are involved in their learning. And studies show when students are involved in their learning, when they take on the driver's seat, they take ownership. Students, when they take ownership, they do better because they're invested in their learning. And so this process of as, for, of is the process where students are the owners of their learning. They reflect. They work with peers to reflect and look at their progress that is aligned with these standards, whether it be English language performance standards, whether it be the college and career readiness standards, whether it be content standards, which are all overlapping. Everything that they do is based on these standards of success. The success criteria is based on these standards. It's not something that is subjective, but it is very much measured along those standards. So again, as is student driven, and the hopes for as is to get students involved in their learning and get them being active thinkers about learning. We then process to the for process of learning for the as, for, of approach. And the for approach is where it's more teacher driven. It still is this collaboration. The for is a collaboration between teachers and students. However, it is teacher driven in the sense that this gives teachers information on what students know. It drives their instruction. Do we need to go back? Can we go forward? Do I need to explain more? So this for component, even though it's collaborative between teachers and students, it is definitely driven by the teacher. This is where teachers give that feedback, that immediate feedback for students so that they can make the adjustments that they need. So let's look at this formative assessment for. Margaret Heritage defines the process as an ongoing cycle with a continuous feedback loop that occurs within the flow of instruction. So it occurs while within instruction, it's embedded in instructions. It begins with teachers identifying the goals or objectives for a lesson or a series of lessons, along with a criteria for success. Teachers elicit evidence of student learning using a variety of strategies. This information is then interpreted in order to identify the gap between the student's current performance and the intended learning objectives. So that's the overall look of what for learning is in the as for of process. So assessment for learning really is key for backwards planning, or what we would call understanding by design. The way it's set up, it is a key component in just neatly fitting into that arena. And so understanding by design begins with outcomes, the intended outcomes. It comprises those essential questions and those big ideas for the unit. The next thing it does is it has these performance assessments embedded within the lessons and classroom instruction. So again, when you hear as for of, it really does align very well with this backwards planning or understanding by design. And so those are the as, and that's the for components. Again, those two go hand in hand, even though they're driven by different data. We have student driven, we have teacher driven with collaboration of students. So now we're going to look at the of component of as for of. The of component is the summative part of this as for of model, and it is usually a performance piece. Again, studies show that for ELL students to get optimal learning, it should be performance-based. Again, it allows them to have student choice. Again, when students have choice, they have buy-in. When students have buy-in, then they tend to be in the driver's seat and so of their learning. And so this of component definitely deals with the summative part of it, which should be performance-based, product-based. And so that is the as for of assessment. Again, it is assessment that is comprehensive and balanced. Now, what I want to do is I want to walk you through gathering data around the 4 domains for ELL students: listening, speaking, reading, writing. So we're going to look at what kind of data we're looking for with those 4 components, and then we're going to look at an example of each for the developing, gathering, analyzing, interpreting. And so I will use a video that I've watched and give you information on how this teacher did each one of those. So let's look at now, how do we gather data around the 4 domains? Well, when we look at listening, and some of these will overlap. Some of the ways we gather data will overlap for several of them, or even some of them, all of them. So for listening, we can observe classroom interaction. We can make checklists based on performance indicators or descriptors, have tallies of students' performance on oral input. And so those would be all ways that we could gather data for listening. For speaking, we could, again, have direct observation. We could record them speaking. They could have maybe a speaking event or some kind of speaking assignment that is performance-based. And so those are all ways that we can collect data for speaking. With speaking, one of the things that I do want to note is that sometimes with speaking, we want to just look at language use based on the English language proficiency, and we want to separate the content knowledge. So when we're looking at English language proficiency, we want to alleviate the content knowledge at that part and just deal with those components, the English language proficiency. Next, reading. Ways we can collect data for reading. We could have this systematic written record of progress presented over a period of time based on language objectives and targets. Again, we always want our data based on or our success criterion based on standards: English language proficiency, college and career readiness, content standards. Again, they overlap, and so it's easy to do that. And then writing, we can collect data by using a variety of writing genres such as journals, blogs, poems, letters. Again, a variety of performance pieces so that we can see what the student can do. We want to align these with the WIDA I Can descriptors. So again, we want to go a level up of where our student is, depending on what level they're in each one of the 4 domains. One of the things to note about writing is that you want to scaffold or give them a gradual release on that. We want to do a lot of showing them how to do it, then doing it together, and then letting them do it. So it is this gradual release of teaching students how to write in English, because that is one of those things that is definitely a challenge for students. So now that we've looked at we've been introduced to the student, we've now looked at comprehensive balanced assessment, we now looked at ways to gather data around all 4 domains. Let's look at an example of how to do all 4 of these: develop, gather, analyze, and interpret ELL student data. The video that I looked at, it was a video revolved around a teacher, Miss Bouchard, and she wanted her students to learn how to have collaborative discussion. So the first thing that Miss Bouchard did is she and her students, she had them in groups first. But they worked in groups at first, talking about defining what is collaborative discussion. And once the students did that, then they talked about as a class what collaborative discussion is. Once they set the parameter what collaborative discussion was, they then looked at what would be the success criteria for a collaborative discussion. And so the teacher, Ms. Bouchard, and the class together came up with those success criteria that would outline what was a successful collaborative discussion. So when we look at those, that would be the development part of it. They develop their success criterion, and then they go from there to now gather and interweave that within instruction. So once the students had the class had their success criteria, then what Ms. Bouchard had them to do was, then she had them to apply what they had learned or what they had set as goals for success criteria. So the students then practice having collaborative discussion, and once that was done, the students self-reflected. However, while that was going on, Miss Bouchard was taking notes going around taking notes about the progress of students in the learning process of formative assessment. So the as process was where the students did a self-reflection once they had this collaborative discussion, and then the of part was where the teacher, Miss Bouchard, was taking notes and giving feedback based on what she saw from these collaborative discussions. One of the things that she had them also do was to reflect on how they met the criterions. So that was the self-reflection, but they also talked about what they would do differently. One of the things that she did once she gathered the information about what students was doing, she analyzed the information, and very quickly she saw some trends. She saw that they had successfully met one criteria while they hadn't done so well on the other one. And so Miss Bouchard brought the students back together as a group again, and they discussed as a group what it was. Again, they looked at those success criteria and they talked about what they had done well, what they hadn't done so well. And Miss Bouchard gave them another opportunity to to be successful on both of the criteria. So again, it is this ongoing process where assessment is interweaved. It is this process where the teacher can continually assess this is what they're doing well according to the success criteria, along with the students, and this is where they need to work, or this is where I need to change strategies or whatever, so forth, so on. So then once she did that, she analyzed, she saw the trends, and then she was able to interpret or adjust her teaching based on what she saw from the performance pieces that they were doing embedded within their lesson. And so she could either choose to adjust her strategy, or she could and see where the gaps were, or she could continue if they were doing well on it, and make sure that they were going to meet the unit objectives, those outcomes that they had talked about. So again, she developed, having the students help her develop those success criteria. She gathered information. She went around through observation and tallies and checks and gathered information. She analyzed that information, looking for trends or things that they had done well or not so well. And then she interpreted that to see where she needed to make adjustments. So the students did a self-reflection. They talked about things that they would do different. The teacher gave them, through the gathering process, immediate feedback on things that they could have done as they were doing their self-reflection. She would walk around and conference with them. They analyzed and interpreted the data. And so that is truly a more comprehensive and balanced assessment system, the as of for model for ELL students. With those kind of adjustments, Robert will be able to successfully acquire the language needed to be cognitive and linguistically sound so that he can do his content work. And so those are the tools that we're going to practice using. Thank you.